Hello, welcome to your last video tutorial on Project 1. So this project is going to result in a very specific type of sculpture, and there are some guidelines for what it is that you need to create on BB Learn under Projects in the left menu. If you haven't checked that out, definitely do so when you get a chance. There are some examples from previous semesters that might help you visualize what's possible. But let me just give you an overview. So you've been making lots of components without necessarily knowing what the end game is here. These components are going to be assembled into a non-objective, asymmetrically balanced, dynamic sculpture. So that's a lot of words. Let's break down what that means. Non-objective is the art term that most people would associate with abstract. So in other words, you're not going to be putting your components for the sculpture get together to make something that's realistic or recognizable, like a person or a building or anything like that. Rather, you're just going to be combining shapes and forms together in a way that is visually pleasing. So a non-objective sculpture. It's also going to be asymmetrically balanced. So you're probably familiar with the term asymmetry. It means that if you cut something down the center, it's going to be different on the left versus on the right. When we say it's asymmetrically balanced, we mean that even though it's different on the left versus the right, there is a sense that the visual weight is equal. There isn't one part of the sculpture that's much heavier than another part of the sculpture. So you'll learn in this video some ways to kind of visually balance things out. It's very common with Project 1 for students to want to create a symmetrically balanced sculpture. So symmetry is when you split that center line and it is equal on the left versus the right, or mirrored. And the reason I think that people go there is because you have this sphere, this box, and this pyramid, and people always want to stack them up like a totem, but you're not going to do that. You're going to avoid that urge at all costs, and instead you're going to build something that is asymmetrical. And part of the reason for that is because of the third thing that the sculpture needs to be, which is dynamic. So dynamic means that something has got a lot of built-in energy and movement and excitement to it. And symmetrical sculpture, it's difficult to do that because it's the same on the left versus on the right. It tends to be more static, a little bit more even boring sometimes, not always, but often. So we'll help ourselves out by avoiding this from the start, making it asymmetrical, making that difference on the left versus the right, which will help add visual interest. There's also a number of other things that we will build into the sculpture, including an interesting interaction of positive and negative space. The positive space being the actual forms of your sculpture, the negative space being what's inside or around those forms. If you have an interesting interaction between your sculpture and what's around it, so your sculpture reaches out into space in an interesting way and carves out shapes in between itself that are interesting, you'll have a much more dynamic sculpture. We will also consider the notion of tension. So tension in a sculpture is when you have sort of a potential energy built up. You have things that come together and create a movement with your eye that is full of anticipation. So things that come close and almost touch, or things that seem like they're going to move or don't. All of those sort of increase the visual tension, and that's another way to add dynamism in your sculpture. So I'll be showing you some ways of doing this while I'm actually building an example sculpture for you. But to do that, we need to go to the studio. So let's head to the studio now. In addition to the more conceptual aspects of Project 1, you need to have some practical things included in your sculpture. First and foremost, your three geometric forms that you made, your pyramid, your box, and your sphere, have to be included some way or another. You need at least one fabricated component that is not one of your geometric forms, so it might be a spiral or a spring, rings, a chain, something just original and organic that you fabricated. Any of those would meet the requirement. You also have to have at least one forged element. You also need something that is rectilinear other than your box and triangle. So rectilinear means it's made of straight lines and angles. So you see these forged elements here are rectilinear, those would qualify. And you need something curvilinear that is something other than your sphere. So a curvilinear means made of curved lines. So you see I have these organic fabricated curves here. Those would meet the requirement for sure. You need to include a found object of some type. It can be a metal found object that you have welded on there, or it can be something else that you've included in another way. I have a selection of found objects here for myself. And then finally, and it's a little difficult to just show here, you're going to need a kinetic component. Kinetic just means that it moves. And a lot of artists make kinetic art with motors and things like that. We don't expect you to do that. What we want is just something that has the ability to move. So for example, my riveted piece here has the ability to move. So does the little trike wheel that I found as a found object. So you need to include at least one element that has the capacity to move or is kinetic. Now I should note, because people always ask, that there can be some crossover in your components. For example, you could have a component that is forged and it's also curvilinear. As long as you are able to point out that it meets both those requirements, you'll be golden for Project 1. Let's talk briefly about getting set up for putting together Project 1. First, I have my oxyacetylene set up here all ready to go. I'm on the one that has kind of the funny dial, but my acetylene is back to 5, my oxygen is between 1 and 20. I've got everything turned on correctly and my torch all unwrapped and hung and ready to go. I've also gathered a few tools for myself. I have a piece of welding rod, which if it's not out on the table, you can find it in the stand over by the door. I have a striker, and I have my welding glasses. We're back to using welding glasses because we're actually going to be welding. I have my gloves for welding, a bolt cutters, which is going to be very important, a couple of hammers. It's unlikely that I'll need them, but I prefer to have my tools laid out so that I don't have to walk across the room in the middle of building, vice grips, and a couple of pliers of different types. So it's a good idea to get those tools ready for yourself so that it's all at your fingertips. The other thing that it's good to get ready for yourself is your actual components that you have gathered that you may be including in this sculpture. You are not required to use every single component that you have made, but having a wide selection of them gives you lots of options, and having them laid out lets you see what those options and possibilities are. This particular sculpture might be a little different than art that you've done in the past. In other words, oftentimes in art classes, you're asked to come up with a pretty detailed plan, do some sketches, do some other kinds of models in order to figure out exactly what you want to do. And we will do that for later projects in this class. But for this project, I really want you to just think about what works in the moment. So you're going to have your various components that you'll put together. You'll put two things together. You'll step back, you'll take a look, and you'll decide what needs to be added to that in order to create the kind of sculpture that is visually interesting to you. Because I'm welding, you'll notice I have my glasses and my gloves all ready to go, and I have a couple components out that I'm going to start with. So much of the rest of the video is just going to be you watching me figure out what goes with what in order to create that dynamic, asymmetrical sculpture with some tension to it. Now, as you're working, you are welcome to alter any of the components that you're working with, and that includes your geometric forms. They do not have to be left whole. I need to be able to recognize that they're there, but beyond that, you get to do what you want. The hardest thing probably getting started is getting the thing to stand initially. So I'm thinking, got this funny sort of joint curve organic thing that I made that I'd kind of like to be a structure in my piece, and I think I would like to join it to my pyramid and have the point of my pyramid maybe be one of the legs on which my sculpture stands. But obviously I'm holding this up with two hands and I don't have a free hand to weld with, so sometimes you may have to lay something down. So actually what I think I'll do here is I'll build up something for this to sit on so I don't have to try to hold it in place while I am sculpting. So I'm going to grab some fire bricks. Okay, so I've propped my sculpture up on some fire bricks. Always easier to work with things if you don't have to hold too much of them. I am going to push down on this piece a little bit until I can get it tacked. but I'm trying to get a fairly straight line in between this curve and the line of the triangle. As always, I'm heating up the metal that's a little bit thicker first. In this case, the corner of my triangle. Okay, pretty solidly tacked together. I'm just holding it until it cools a little bit. I'm going to grab my welding rod, fill in. As with your square and your pyramid, I'm not hitting the same spot that I tacked, but rather another side, waiting until it gets liquid, feeding that rod in there. So I get a nice strong weld all the way around. This is going to have to bear some pressure, so I need to make sure the weld is reasonably strong. So now I've got this first form kind of in space. While it's still hot, I can change the angle or bend a little bit. Let me turn that guy off for a sec. That looks pretty good. Okay, now it's still not standing on its own. You'll find that it really won't stand on its own until you have at least a tripod. So I think I'm going to bring something off this end over to the floor over here to extend out in space in that direction. Right now it's pretty flat this way. It would be nice to have something visually here. I also have this piece here that is just kind of cut off. It's not forged out or anything. It's just a bolt cutter cut, which is kind of ugly. I really don't want that to be something that stops the eye as it moves through my sculpture. So having something come off of here makes sense. So let's see what we have that could possibly be interesting right there. So, well, I have a couple of these curlicues that have forged ends on them. So I can see if that's something that I like. Not really. What else do I have that's interesting? I have this funny little hook here. Which, okay, I kind of like that because it makes this nice sharp curve here, and then it has an interesting intersection with the floor where that hook hits the floor. So I think I'll try to put it together like this. Again, we need to find a way to hold this in place while we're going to weld. So I'm going to grab a very specific piece of equipment. These stools are located over by the sink. So you can grab one of these and use it to stand your sculpture up temporarily until you can get something welded in place. What I'm doing here. So I wanted that to kind of go like this. Just deciding whether I want it to have a compound bend or whether I want it to come straight off this piece. I like the idea of a compound bend. And then this piece is kind of resting up against my stool. I can actually use my vice grips, everybody's favorite tool, right? To hold this in place. So I'm going to open those jaws up so that they're big enough to accommodate both the stool leg and my hook. Okay, after a bit of manipulation, I've got that where I want it to be. So I can start hitting this joint to tack it. So I don't even need to tack here because it's held pretty well in place. So I can just get both halves really rip roaring hot so I see that liquid puddle form. just going to hit the end of this a little bit with the heat to knock that nubbin off there. And I'll let it cool down a little bit. I'm going to flip it over and hit it from the other side. So while I'm waiting for it to cool, I can take my vice grips off maybe. Flip this guy over. Once you have something welded once, especially if you're kind of welding up in the air, be really careful that you don't hit it with too much heat because you'll just collapse the thing that you just welded together, which is a very sad day. The hardest thing that you will do here is get that welding rod off the floor. All right, let my torch up again. You will notice that in between working with the torch, I am setting it on the floor. That's totally okay, but do not walk away from it. If you have to get up to go across the room and get a chair or whatever, please put it back on the tank so nobody steps on it or trips over it. Got a nice strong weld in there. Round off that little nubbin. Turn my torch off. Now this is going to be something that is supporting the weight of my sculpture, so I'm going to give it a second to cool off before I actually flip it up and see how things look. In the meantime, I can move my stand out of the way. All right, let's see what we have. All right, now we're starting to get somewhere. So we have a piece that stands on its own. It's got at least a tripod. You might have more points connecting with the ground. And it's also, we can get these fire bricks out of the way, starting to look pretty interesting from all directions. Again, I'm not going to grab this with my bare hand. But it's got like some interesting motion happening to it. You know, a lot of times, because getting this sort of dynamic tripod set up or a dynamic ascension out into space is difficult, what many students want to do, move this out of the way for a second, is they want to use their rectangle or their pyramid as a base, okay, flat on the ground. And I'm going to tell you right now, it's not that you can't do that, but it's going to be much more difficult for you to end up with a dynamic sculpture if you start this way, because this is inherently a static form. It's on the ground, it's got these horizontal lines. If you remember the line reading about horizontal lines being more stable because we associate them with the horizon or with lying down. So this is maybe not the most interesting way to start. Now I have seen people do sculptures that started here and then they really became an explosion of dynamic interest, but it's probably more likely that you'll have success if you do something like this. Let's talk for a moment about some design things. So I think I mentioned already the hard stop when you have something like this line right here where it was cut with a bolt cutters, or it's just the natural end of the steel rod and it just has a hard stop to it. As much as possible, you want to try to avoid those sorts of places on your sculpture, because again, if you're wanting somebody's eye to move through and for this to be a dynamic experience, this kind of line, since it's flat on the end, stops the eye. Much better is to have things that have a point to them, a drawn out point, or potentially have a circle or something like that. So I need to think about what to do with some of those places on my sculpture. Even this one to extent, although I think that one's probably okay, where it's stopping the eye. Another thing that I need to think about at this point is, now that I've got a structure that stands on its own, I have to make sure that I'm getting all of my required components in here. I've already got my pyramid in here. I've got a fabricated form. I've got a forged form. I've got a curvilinear form. Still missing another rectilinear form, and I'm missing my sphere and my box and also my kinetic element. So there's a lot more that I can add in here. And you can go much beyond that. Your sculpture can be, you know, pretty big. have a lot of energy to it, or it can be a little bit more minimal. We are shooting for things that are about, half human height, 3 feet or so, is about where we're going with this. So let me start to think about what sorts of other things I could do with this sculpture. This is where the fun part of this comes from, is you're going to get to try to put together a puzzle. So for this line here, I'm actually thinking it might be kind of fun. I have this little partial spiral that I made. It might be kind of fun to have this piece on here because instead of having this point that stops, then I'm going to have something that comes down here and kind of curls around and is very playful and fun. So that might be a possibility there. I could also look at, including another forged form. So I have this sort of, what if I did something like this where I doubled up the line and then I have this nice sharp point. I actually don't hate that, but I think I like the little coil better. So let's go ahead and we'll do that. We'll put this little coil in here and finish out that line real nicely. I'm not going to worry about balancing this one up. I think it's simple enough that I can just kind of hold it where it needs to be, at least long enough to tack it. Remember with tacking, heat flows towards heat, so you want to get both ends really hot and kind of direct that driplet towards the area where it needs to be. And I'm going to kind of heat from the other side. Fill some rod in there. This is the actual welding, filling the rod in. Tacking it, all that does is hold it temporarily in place. You haven't penetrated through the metal at all, so it won't hold anything very well. Just a temporary measure to get things together enough for you to be able to weld. Now I'm just cleaning up, because this is at an odd angle, gravity has not been my friend, and just cleaning up some of those strips so I have a little bit smoother looking line along here. That's part of our craftsmanship, trying to make sure those welds aren't distracting. Okay, so now I have this little double foot over here that's kind of interesting and nice. Let me start to think about what I'm going to do with my other geometric forms. Turn that around so you can maybe see it. So when I'm looking at this from every angle, it's actually pretty interesting from this direction, from this direction, but from the side, it has a little bit of an imbalance right now. We want this to be asymmetrical, so it's definitely that. It's different from right to left. However, we've got this sort of big area over here, doesn't have anything going on. And I have this geometric form down here, so maybe I want to think about doing something with my rectangle where it's over here and it sort of extends out into this space a little bit. So you can see I'm just kind of moving it around, trying to get a sense of what might be interesting. Okay. I think I'm actually going to break this rectangle up a little bit, and that's something you can absolutely do, is you can break your geometric forms up, in part anyway. You don't want to completely take it apart. I'm going to cut it here at the corner because I think it might be interesting to have one of these sort of form another leg. So I'm going to bend this a little bit. And you remember to bend something. We keep the spot that we want to bend. In this case, since we have a weld where we want to bend, I'm going to keep just barely above the weld, because welds don't really like to be reheated. Not way up here, just like a millimeter above it. Just hot enough so it gets a little bit red. And then I can bend this out nice and easily. So let's see what we can come up with here that might be sort of interesting. Sometimes it takes a while to figure out where exactly you want something to be. Now that's kind of interesting, to sort of have that joined with this piece down here on the end of my naturalistic curve and have it stand out in space like that. I actually like that. It solves two problems for me. One, it sort of brings something active into this space over here, and the other one, it deals with that end that's just chopped off. It also creates some interesting negative spaces. So remember, you want to be considering the negative spaces in here, and we've got this negative space here, and since we cut this, we have a nice negative space in here now too. So that might be a really interesting thing to do with it. Let me see if I can kind of prop this up more or less where I want it to be. So I'm just going to get it close-ish where it's sort of holding its form. And then I can always tweak the positioning a little bit if I need to, which I will. Trying to keep the flame off the concrete itself because there is some dirt and stuff on the concrete that might spit back at you if you have the flame right down on it. And again, just try to get these reasonably well packed together. And I'm going to adjust a little bit while it's still hot. Let that kind of cool in place. Yeah, that's starting to be something kind of interesting. Again, you'll notice me walking around a lot to check things out from different sides. See if I can get this weld a little bit stronger. Because it has to hold all of the weight of that rectangle. That should be pretty good. Gonna let it cool just a little bit. Pick this guy up, and then I'm gonna make sure I position this where I want it to be while it cools off. All right, I have a feeling that the weight of this rectangle, when I let go, it's gonna make it wanna flop a little bit. So that'll be an engineering thing for me to solve. Is going to want to come down to the ground because it's a lot of weight. So maybe there's an opportunity for me to put something that connects these. I don't want to completely close up this negative space that I've created, but I might want to add a little something in there. So let's see what I have that might be interesting in there. So I have this little forged shape. I've got this little forged shape here. This one's kind of interesting. So I've got a flattened end here and then some fabricated curves. So something like this might be kind of nice, where it goes through the center of that rectangle. We refer to that as breaking the plane when we come through something that's an implied plane like this. But then it continues out the other side, and again, that can be a really nice sort of energetic, dynamic thing to do. It creates some tension, so some visual interest through the relationship of parts. So I think I'm going to do something kind of like this, where I connect it to this piece over here. Maybe I will connect it to this one that's sort of just an end. Come through here and hit my box and then come through the other side. All right, so I'm going to join this in a couple of places to this piece. I'm actually going to tack this in a couple of places because I want it to hold its weight. Okay, I'll come back to that and weld it a little stronger, but I want to position my rectangle Whenever you have something that is connected in more than one place, it's going to be stronger than something that's just connected here. So again, I'm taking the time to kind of figure out how I want this positioned in space. That looks pretty good. Sometimes when doing this, it's a little hard to see where something needs to go. So my recommendation is to tack these and then take a look. You can always hit it with heat again and melt through the tack and move something if it's not where it needs to be. Okay. I'm going to kind of prop this with my leg while I weld from the other side. All right, let that cool a little bit. Guy with a little bit more of a, it's just sort of heavily tacked right now. Okay. Turn this off so I can bend a little bit better. Where I want this to be. Hold it in place while that cools. Okay, so now I have my square form in there, my box form, and we can start to see how it's looking from all directions. Pretty good. There's a bit of a dead spot right in here, but we have other forms that we can potentially use to rectify that. We still have to get our sphere in here and our kinetic piece at the very least. Now, I could spend all day playing with this sculpture. I'm not going to make you watch that long a demonstration, but just keep in mind that this is kind of the bare minimum to have these components in there, and then hopefully you're building towards something that's just really pleasing from every direction. Remember, we're considering things like asymmetrical balance. We are considering things like breaking the planes, creating tension. Areas like here where we have a curve and a little space in between create tension. If I had two things that come close together and almost touch, that creates tension. Something that comes close to the ground and almost touches, that creates tension because it's about that relationship in there. So be aware of that and think about ways in which you might be doing that as you work. I think the next thing I'm going to do is try to get my kinetic piece in here, and I have a pretty good idea where and how I want to do that. So, I have this little forged out leaf form with a flat end. I think what I'm going to do here is I'm going to weld this on to this piece here, maybe so it's at an angle and we create this nice negative space in here. And then I'm going to hang this wheel off of the end of that. So let's see if we can do that. So I'm getting both pieces hot to tack them. Remember, your metal flows towards heat. So if I want this piece that I'm holding up here to tack onto the one that's attached to the sculpture, I need to get that one attached to the sculpture really hot and then force that grip in there. Again, this is going to have to support some weight, so I want a pretty strong weld. Just adjusting the angle of that a little bit. I know my big head's in the way, but hopefully you can get the idea. And I got one more little gap over here I'm going to weld in. So get that nice and solid on there. figure out how I want to position my wheel. I think it'd be kind of nice if the curve of the wheel is going sort of nested in this curve right here. Now this one's going to be a bit of a challenge because this wheel is heavy and it's kinetic, it's mobile. So I'm going to have to get this nice and hot. My arm is going to get tired in the process. This would be a really hard one to brace up on something because again the wheel moves. If you have a piece like this in your sculpture and you need some help, please call me over and I will help hold the piece for you because it is really hard sometimes. Get that pretty solidly tacked on there. I'm going to hold it for a minute. Until it's on there. Okay, so I'm going to try to prop this up with my knee so I'm taking some of the weight off the joint while I'm welding it. Just be careful if you do this, that you're not burning yourself, either with the metal or the plane. And I'm going to let it cool in between, even though I'm still going to fill in here a little bit because this, again, is heavy and I don't want it to break off of there. And I'm just building up the thickness a little bit here. This is really important when you have a heavy piece coming off something from just one joint, that you check to make sure you don't have any of those little cracks in your welds, like we talked about when you did your geometric shapes. While it's hot, I'm just kind of adjusting the angle how I want it. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. I actually think that I want this here to bend a little bit more, so while that other piece is cooling, I'm going to keep just above that welded joint. Bring this over so we have an angle rather than a straight line. All right, liking where it's going. So, what else do we need to do here? Well, I've got almost all of the required components. The one thing I don't have in here yet is the sphere. Turn this off for a second. The sphere is one of the more difficult forms to work with. It's got a lot of visual weight to it. Sorry, spirals. A lot of visual weight to it. It's heavy. It's got actual weight and it's got visual weight. It's also very self-contained. So a lot of times you put it in here and if it's a whole thing, it kind of feels like it takes things over. But I have this rounded and fairly visually heavy found object over here, so that is going to help me balance my sphere a little bit, I think. And I kind of remember I talked about having this little dead spot here. Kind of feel like the sphere is going to need to go in here. I could keep it whole, but I think I'm going to break it up. I'm going to open it up so that we have that negative space in the center that we can access. We'll have this whole sort of interconnecting negative space. Now with the sphere, really hard to cut the sphere right at the joint, so I'm going to do my best, but if you have a little nubbin that sticks out or something, you always hit that with the welder and get that to back off. I seem to have a pair of bolt cutters that aren't super great. Many of you have experienced that over the last week, these bolt cutters that don't come together super well and don't want to cut through. There we go, now we got it. And again, I'm going to want to bend this out, so I'm going to heat this spot at the top on that rod that I just cut so that I can move it. Some people take their spheres and cut them in half, so they have a sphere, half a sphere in two different places. You can do something like that. Some people cut multiple legs off the sphere, or bend out multiple legs. You can really alter these forms a lot, Or you don't have to at all. If you like it just as a solid form, you labored over the sphere to get it just perfect and you don't want to mess it up, you don't have to. Don't worry about it. Okay? Get that warm, and now I can bend that form out a little bit. I actually think I might break my weld here entirely and turn it around so that I have kind of a sphere on a basket. So let's do that. Sitting on my cord here. Okay, so since I'm going to weld onto a big mass of things that have already been welded together, make sure that I heat that up first. My torch has a little booger in it, but I'm going to try to see if I can make it through before I clean it out. Okay, tacked in there. Let it kind of harden in place. Then I'm going to weld from the other side. That's a bit better. All right. So now I've got this kind of, I don't know how you would call that, partially deconstructed sphere. I think I'd like it to come off at this point. Let's see how that looks. Maybe I'd like to have it come off that point there and have it crisscross with this other curve that I made. That's kind of interesting. It creates a little thicker line quality in there. Let's do that. Okay, kind of an awkward thing to have to hold and weld at the same time. If you need help with something like that, call me over. There, we got it. Move that where I want it to be. Okay. Now I'm going to try to get it from another side here while I prop it up with my leg a little bit. So this is nice because I have two places I can tack this, which again for a heavy form, nice to have it joined in multiple places. Holding it until the metal isn't cherry red again because it's going to want to bend if I don't do that because there's so much weight on it. All right. Now we're starting to get there. In fact, let me get this extra stuff out of the way here. Let's do a check for our required forms. So do we have our three geometric forms in here? We do. Our pyramid, our box, and our sphere. Do we have a fabricated piece? Absolutely, we've got several of them. A fabricated piece here, a fabricated piece here, fabricated piece here. Do we have a forged piece? Yes, multiple ones here, and the hook, and the end here. Do we have a curvilinear piece that is not the sphere? Absolutely, multiple curvilinear pieces in here. How about a rectilinear piece, straight lines and angles? We don't have as many of those, but we do have a straight line here, and I could certainly add some other ones if I wanted to. And finally, do I have our kinetic piece? Yes, we do, right here. And our found object, same thing, so it's a 2 for 1. If I wanted to do more in there, I could, and in fact, I might continue to work on this sculpture because I'm not really sure I think it's complete. Let's take a look at it from all angles and see how we feel about it. So if I step back from it, lots of interesting movement here, although I do think that's a little too straight across the top. There might be an opportunity to do a another breaking of this plane here and having another angle here, which would create tension between these two pieces because we kind of complete that implied form. Pretty well balanced here. It's that same area right there that's still a problem. I think there needs to be something that extends up here so it's not so flat across the top. Pretty well balanced with the two rounded forms. But yeah, not bad at all. This would definitely meet the requirements of the sculpture, and you see it's kind of kinetic in and of itself because it just moves, and I can come down here and play with my train wheel if I want to too. And I didn't use all of the component pieces I have by far. There's still a lot to play with. So it's really great if you can come in and work one day and then take a little break from your sculpture and come back and work another day, because oftentimes you see that, hey, there's this little thing that I could tweak and make better. But that is the extent of the demo for this particular part of assembling it. So that will be your task next class, is to take the pieces that you've made, the components, and put them together in something that is dynamically balanced, asymmetrical, shows tension, shows good positive and negative space relationships, maybe there's some breaking of the plane going on, all of those good terms that you've been learning. I hope you enjoyed watching this put together, and I hope even more that you enjoy assembling your own sculpture next week. See you then.